I put the screws to Leonard Panisi over the others because he had been deemed a useless throwaway, not only by me but by society at large. His mugshot on the post office poster said as much. I had a habit of browsing the P.O.'s most wanted sheets whenever I bought stamps, just to see if an Italian hoodlum from my past was there, strung up by his borders, riddled with thumbtacks. Sure enough. On paper, Panisi had the same twisted mouth and wall-eyed expression that heaped scorn on me at St. Ignatius High School, but his head was shaved like a subversive skinhead's. An inscrutable scar dented his left cheek, like the gash on a car sideswiped by a bus. I knew right away who it was, and I wasn't at all surprised he'd succumb to a life of crime. The reward meant nothing to me except that I'd be saving the United States government $5,000 by not claiming it. Leonard was described as a career criminal, with a rap sheet longer than my brother Sal's and far more damnable. He'd become a fugitive wanted for slaying a Fort Leavenworth soldier. Staring stock still in front of his Sicilian kisser, all the old wounds festered. The hate bubbled up from deep inside, hate that I'd sublimated over time and therefore became less compelling, made me less of a victim. But the wrongdoing still smarted when I allowed myself to think about them, and they had to be avenged, an eye for an eye. I had to find Leonard Panisi before the Federal Bureau of Investigation did. This was my last chance to put a serious hurt on him. But how? If the FBI couldn't track him down, what were my chances? I racked my brain to summon up the other revolting members of his old clique. Finally, the name Hamster skittered in. That was the gang's name for Squealer because he'd exterminated the hamsters that Brother Albin had raised in the chemistry lab, and because Squealer was just too waspy a name. He was a sleaze, but I knew he still lived in Kansas City. I'd seen him around. He'd served in Vietnam and had lost a leg, and that made him easy to spot. For whatever reason, he didn't wear a prosthesis. First thing I did was buy one of those cut-rate prepaid cell phones so my calls couldn't be traced. Every conversation from here on out had to be made on the burner. Incredibly, I found a number for Squealer in the first place I looked, the phone book. I couldn't trust the internet's dubious white pages to give me squat, though I would have tried it next. Facebook had only just been launched the February before, and its use wasn't widespread yet. Nobody I knew was there. One of the FBI's most wanted would definitely not be there. Fortunately, Squealer's last name was as unique as his first, and he still had a landline. With PTSD, he probably didn't trust cell phones. Big Brother watched us. 1984 was high on Brother Simeon's reading list at Ignatius. I gave a fake name, Pete Casanova, which I didn't expect him to recognize and didn't ask me to repeat. After fighting a losing battle in the Mekong Delta, I was betting he wouldn't trouble himself to prove or disprove my identity. What would be the point? How many calls does one get from his alma mater anyway? Other than himself, he probably had nothing to hide. I stated the specious purpose of my call, to invite him to his 30th annual St. Ignatius High School reunion. I knew its time had come because I'd already gotten my invitation from a legitimate alumnus. The affair was being held in the old gym, typical of Ignatius that did everything on the cheap. It wasn't even a secondary educational institution anymore, but a 501c3 trade school for dropouts funded mostly by federal grants. If someone had already contacted Squealer, I'd merely apologize, but I wouldn't stop there. He was as cold and crisp as an ice chip. Not interested, he said. I tried to be nice, asked how he was doing, told him I knew that he'd been in the military and that he had a rough time of it. I'm hanging in there was all he said to that, so I left it alone. He was beginning to sound like a mountain man in the wilderness, a grizzly hermit bent on sheer survival. To my knowledge, he had no 30-year-old axe to grind with anybody from high school. He'd antagonized us there, then. But he wasn't the least bit friendly, strictly matter-of-fact all the way, like he'd lost the ability to be sociable somewhere in Cambodia. In the event that Squealer and Leonard were still tight, that Squealer knew Leonard was on the lam and was protecting him, I didn't want Squealer to think I was probing to uncover Leonard's whereabouts. Any mention of Panisi had to come from Squealer. To keep the ball rolling, I mentioned a few of the more infamous graduates, a teacher or two, then I named a couple of other guys in their posse. I claimed to have already spoken to them, and they had used his tag name from school. He jumped at the opportunity to inform on Leonard. Panisi snuffed those hamsters, not me. Seeming more redeemed than annoyed, he wanted to set the record straight. There was my opening. Skylar said he hadn't seen Leonard in a year or so. Last time I ran into him, he was just out of jail for some drug-related shit. Oh, I said emphatically. Sorry to hear that. Knowing the penis, Skylar volunteered, invoking Leonard's a.k.a. Ignatius. He probably enjoyed the poking. I didn't ask him to elaborate, but I did briefly consider some of my own erotic speculations. What's Leonard up to otherwise? I asked casually. Married? Kids? That was important to me. I didn't give a flying fig for Panisi, but I wasn't about to cause any residual damage to innocent bystanders. He's been married a couple of times and divorced at least once, Skylar began. His first old lady left him during his vacation in the cooler. He seemed to know a lot for not having seen the guy. No kids unless you count a pair of Rottweilers. I felt compelled to crawl on my belly in his jungle a bit. Wish I had me a rod, I clowned, to sick on the Jehovah's Witnesses that prowl my neighborhood. He made a scoffing sound, clearly not a laugh. I came back around to the reunion. The committee expects me to contact everybody, and I wouldn't want to let them down. We don't have a number for Leonard. Would you? My request provoked a genuine cackle. What makes you think he'd come? I don't think one way or the other, Skylar, I said, but we should be fair and give him the chance to decide for himself. Skylar understood fairness. The Vietnam War wasn't fair. Taking the rap for Leonard over Albin's stinking hamsters wasn't fair, but it was the right thing at the time for a loyal friend to do. No, I don't have his number, he said. Shit, fuck, I thought, listening to ourselves breathe. But I do have a number for Pendleton, he said. He was one of their mob that I brought up earlier. Pendleton, I remembered, was more sinister at Ignatius than Skylar, and lamented not being Sicilian like Panisi. I wasn't stupefied that Panisi's sycophant would be in touch with an outlaw who had a price on his head. Any trail was worth following to get to Panisi, lowlife that he was. One thing's for sure, Skylar hadn't been contacted by the feds about a different kind of reunion with Leonard. If he had, he would not have given me the time of day. Ending the conversation, I said cheerfully, "Hope to see you at the reunion," which gagged him. Skylar's movements were limited long before I called. Seconds after hanging up, I realized I hadn't given him any reunion specifics, like date, time, place, cost, or theme.